When we talk about contrast and unity and how they work in conjunction with each other, we're basically talking about how things are similar and how they're different. When elements are similar, that similarity pushes those elements towards each other. When these elements have characteristics that contrast, they are driven apart. It seems like a basic notion, but in art, it can get complicated very quickly. It's also important to know that things can be categorized and evaluated in many different ways, and things are often working on a sliding scale. Basically, elements can be similar or different in varying degrees. To show you what we're talking about, we'll reduce these ideas down to a single element of art: shape. Let's look at this idea by comparing two shapes. Currently, these two squares are the same. How many different ways can we contrast these two squares? Value usually seems to be the most popular way to contrast objects. If one square is black and the other one is white, we would consider this to be a high contrast in value. However, it's important to know that we don't need to create a maximum shift in value to still be talking about contrast. The square on the right now has shifted to a low contrast, but we're still talking about a contrast in value. We can explore other aspects of color. For example, the hue of the squares contrast each other. This would be considered a high contrast because red and green are complementary colors on the color wheel. If the red shifts to a blue-green, the contrast in hue is present. It just shifts to a lower contrast. We can also apply this principle to saturation. Here, the hues and values aren't contrasting each other at all. It is simply the saturation that is at a high contrast. The one square is a very intense green, and the other is very dull, or unsaturated. If we just examine color, we can see that these three categories happen at the same time, and at different levels. These two squares have a high contrast in value and hue, but a minimal contrast in saturation. These squares have a slight contrast in all three categories, and these have a high contrast in all three. It's important to realize these principles of contrast and unity are occurring. When we're creating an artwork and elements seem to be disconnected, we may want to decrease the contrast. If your artwork seems boring, you might want to increase the contrast. Of course, there are many ways in which we can create contrast other than color. We can create a contrast in direction. The horizontal rectangle implies stability and calm. The diagonal rectangle suggests movement and energy. We can contrast the flat square with a textured one. We can also contrast the types of shapes with each other. We can contrast the geometric shape with an organic shape. We can contrast a simple shape with a complex one. We can also create contrast in complexity. There are certainly more ways in which these shapes may contrast each other, but these basic few can go a long way in creating an exciting image. Often, when we're creating or evaluating artwork, elements may seem disconnected. Here, we may want to utilize principles of unity, which will visually bring elements together. There are a number of principles which focus on creating a sense of unity. Today, we'll just focus on similarity. This psychological principle, similarity, suggests items that share a trait will appear to be more unified. This is basically the opposite of the ideas discussed related to contrast. So, if two shapes share traits, they will appear to be more visually connected. If we look at these two shapes, we can see what makes them different: the color. However, if we wanted to make them appear to be more unified, we could shift the colors to have a similar saturation, or they could have a similar value. Instead, we could create a similar outline to visually link these shapes. This is a basic principle, but a powerful one. For example, in painting, there is a technique called glazing. A painter will create a very transparent paint and brush a super thin layer over the entire painting. Before, elements of that painting might have seemed disconnected. However, with a light shade of blue, creating a similarity in color throughout the entire painting, those previously disconnected elements now appear to be more unified. By balancing these ideas of contrast and unity, often, an artist's intention is to give the artwork a sense of visual harmony, where all of the elements seem to create an exciting but unified image. These are just some basic ideas related to this concept of contrast and unity, but considering how these two ideas relate will help you in creating visually exciting images.